Hello everyone and welcome to season 27 of the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Season 27, episode 1, Quintus Sertorius, Reluctant Renegade, part 1. This episode was written by Liam O'Fuelan. Liam is a senior lecturer at the Cork Institute of Technology in the Republic of Ireland, where he conducts research on photonics for applications in sensing and fibre optic communications. He received a PhD in physics from the University of St Andrews in Scotland in 2005 and has written over 90 articles for scientific journals. He is a keen student of history, particularly that of ancient Greece and Rome. Abstract. Quintus Sertorius could lay claim to a position among the greatest generals of ancient times. A loyal Roman who lost an eye defending the Roman frontier. Fortune then pitted him against the Roman military machine and some of its premier commanders, including Pompey the Great. Having chosen the wrong side of the First Civil War, he fought through it with courage and integrity, but at its conclusion he was forced to flee the purges of Sulla. He was then invited to command the rebellious barbarian tribes of Spain. By energy, force of will, and genius, he captivated his men and turned the light, irregular troops into a force that smashed the Roman armies that were sent to bring the Spanish tribes back under the Roman yoke. After a series of campaigns, he gathered other Roman refugees and established a state that imitated that of Rome. Ultimately betrayed and murdered by the local aristocracy, the story of Quintus Sertorius, a man who swam against the tide of Roman history, has largely and unjustly been forgotten. Quintus Sertorius was born in 123 BC in the city of Nursia, situated about 150 kilometres northeast of Rome. He came from an aristocratic family, probably Equites Romani, the class just below a senatus. In his youth he tried his hand at law and oratory, as was common for young Roman nobles. He met with limited success, though he came to the attention of the influential Roman statesman Cicero. Sertorius soon decided that a life of public speaking was not for him and embarked on a military career. His aptitude for this calling quickly became apparent, and it would occupy the rest of his life. His first campaign was against an incursion by the tribes of the Cimbri and the Teutones, Celto-Germanic tribes who had migrated from their original homes in southern Scandinavia and Denmark in the late 2nd century BC. After a circuitous route through modern-day Germany and France, they encountered the Roman Republic in southern Gaul, which is now the region in the south of France, close to the border with Italy. The Roman campaign was a disaster. Due to severe infighting between the two senior commanders, the army was crushed at the Battle of Arausio and lost upwards of 80,000 men. The 18-year-old Sertorius was among the survivors. Despite losing his horse and being wounded, he swam the Rhone in full armour, a testament to his strength and will to live. In the following year, the Cimbri and Teutones continued their migration, and another Roman army was sent to meet them, this time with Gaius Marius in sole command. Marius is famous for reforming the Roman army and creating the professional standardized legionary equipped and armed by the state. Furthermore, to increase troop numbers, he removed the requirement that recruits must own property and instituted retirement benefits in the form of land grants. Sertorius was among the ranks of this army. Prior to the campaign, he went on an undercover mission to reconnoitre the enemy camp. After learning some of the Celtic language and suitably disguised, he gained information on the enemy leaders and returned safely. Due to this and other actions, Sertorius was rapidly promoted by the clearly impressed Marius and entrusted with key responsibilities. Marius manoeuvred carefully, trying to find favourable conditions, and refused battle a number of times. He finally chose to fight at the Battle of Aquae Sextiae. Marius employed a stratagem in which a concealed force of 4,000 men attacked the Teutones from behind at the height of the battle. The tribesmen were thrown into confusion and routed. With the northern Roman borders once again secure, Sertorius made his first acquaintance with Spain, when he was sent with 1,000 men to the city of Castulo, near the modern Linares. Trouble arose as the men became too relaxed in their winter quarters and spent their time drinking. Their behaviour outraged the local population, driving them to revolt. Together with their neighbour, the Gyrasonians, they attacked Castulo and killed a great number of the Romans. Sertorius escaped and rallied the survivors outside the gates. Unperturbed, he counterattacked and killed all the rebels inside, then instructed his men to put on the armour and clothes of the rebels and marched on the town of the Gyrasonians. The unsuspecting inhabitants opened the gates in welcome, at which point Sertorius attacked, killing or capturing most of those inside. The quick-thinking leadership and the ruthlessness which suppressed the rebellion made Sertorius renowned throughout Spain. Returning to Rome, he was appointed quaestor for Cisalpine Gaul, the region of Italy immediately south of the Alps. At this period of the Roman Republic, tensions had arisen between Rome and the other Italian cities. After a series of conflicts, these cities had allied themselves with Rome and supplying more than half of the troops in Roman armies. For their long and faithful service, the soldiers considered themselves entitled to Roman citizenship. When Rome refused them citizenship, the allied cities revolted in what became known as the Social War, which ran between 91 BC and 88 BC. The word social comes from the word socii, the term given to Rome's Italian allies. Rome would ultimately win the war, but only by granting the rights that had initially been demanded by the Italian cities. Sertorius distinguished himself by the energy with which he raised and organised troops, and by his valour in action. Even though he was now a senior commander, he regularly exposed himself to danger. In one such battle, he was blinded in one eye, a point he later considered an honour. As he put it, other public figures had to put down their chains of office and crowns, whereas his badges of honour were always with him. In ancient warfare, it was more usual for generals to be found close to the front line than in the 20th century, and seeing their leaders share their dangers had considerable benefits on the soldiers' morale. Consequently, Sertorius was very popular with the people, yet when he stood for election as a tribune of the people, he was defeated due to the opposition of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who viewed him a friend of his enemy Marius. Sulla was an exceptionally capable general and powerful statesman, serving successfully during the Social War, winning the prestigious Grass Crown, the highest and rarest of all military decorations in the Roman Republic. The Grass Crown was given for saving a legion from destruction, and was awarded by the men themselves. After the conclusion of the war, Sulla was given command of an army that was to go to Greece to fight the forces of Mithridates, the king of Pontus, part of present-day Anatolia in Turkey. Marius and Sulla had developed an intense hatred for one another, and Marius blocked the legislation required for the war so that he could go in Sulla's place, even though he was then an old man. Scandalously, Sulla took 6 legions and marched on Rome, the first time that a Roman general had done so. Declaring Marius a public enemy, he restructured the Senate and left for Greece with his army, leaving Cinna and Octavius as consuls. Cinna, whose only goal was his own advancement, switched his allegiance to Marius. Sertorius then made the fateful decision to join with Cinna, either to oppose the unconstitutional actions of Sulla or to avenge the failure of his election. A massive street battle ensued between the forces of the opposing consuls, and Cinna and Sertorius were forced to flee. They quickly regrouped and mustered enough forces to give battle to Octavius again, and Cinna sent for Marius, who had been in exile in Africa. Sertorius was reluctant to ally himself with Marius, either out of concern for his position as the junior of the partnership, or out of fear for how Marius might revenge himself on Rome. However, Cinna felt honour bound to recall him, and the army was divided between the three men. Octavius was swiftly defeated, and Marius and Cinna installed as consuls. Sertorius's fears appear to have been justified, as the troops of Cinna and Marius now started committing atrocities against their now defenceless enemies. In particular, Marius had armed a band of slaves who were exceedingly brutal towards their former masters and their families. Sertorius, disgusted by this behaviour, could not stand by and ordered his men to round up and kill the 400-strong body of slaves. It is said that Sertorius never killed a man in anger or harmed anyone whom he had overcome, and he continually asked Cinna to restrain Marius's anger and his men. Fortunately for the people of Rome, Marius's reign did not last long, and he died of pleurisy 17 days into his consulship. Neither did Cinna last long. His men had no enthusiasm to fight Sulla, who was now on his way back to Rome. They mutinied and killed Cinna as he made preparations for the war. Marius's son then illegally made himself consul. Sertorius could see the writing on the wall and sought refuge in Hispania. Sure enough, Sulla, on his return, advanced rapidly on Rome for the second time. After a challenging journey, Sertorius entered Hispania and quickly took possession of the country. Hispania, the Roman name for the Iberian Peninsula, was a prosperous land populated with brave and warlike people. Parts had been under Roman control since the Second Punic War and had been brutally exploited by successive Roman governors, who were eternally hungry for military glory and the silver of the Iberian mines. Sertorius quickly gained the gratitude of the nobles by reducing taxes. He found favour with the locals by ordering the quartering of his soldiers away from the cities and towns, thus relieving them of the need to provide lodgings for soldiers, a disagreeable duty. Not relying solely on the goodwill of the Iberians, he also armed all local Romans of a military age. In the meantime, Sulla had taken control of Rome once again and made himself dictator with the aid of the 23-year-old Gnaeus Pompeius, the future Pompey the Great and opponent of Julius Caesar. Sulla drew up lists of enemies, outlawed them, and put a price on their heads. The majority of those proscribed were killed for their property. Ultimately, 9,000 Roman aristocrats went to their deaths. Julius Caesar, then aged 18, was among those listed and barely escaped death. Sertorius expected Sulla to send an army to recover Hispania, the only part of Roman territory not under his control, and dispatched an army to the Pyrenees to block the passes. But fortune deserted him. Through treachery, the army mutinied, killing its commander, and then dispersed. Sertorius was no longer able to give battle and was forced to retreat to Nova Carthage, present-day Cartagena, on the southeast corner of the peninsula, and take a ship to Mauritania with his remaining men. His misfortune continued as he and his men withdrew. The local inhabitants attacked them. He then allied himself with some of the local priests and succeeded in taking the island of Pityusa from the Roman garrison. Rome soon dispatched a fleet to recover the island, and as Sertorius sailed out to meet them, a strong storm blew up, wrecking many of his ships and forcing the remainder to escape through the Straits of Gibraltar and seek shelter on the Atlantic coast with some local tribes. As they recovered, 2 seamen arrived from some islands in the Atlantic. The weary Sertorius listened to the men's tales, which told of an island paradise a few days' sail from Hispania. There the weather was never extreme, and the rich soil provided the inhabitants with all they needed for little labour. Stories of these islands occur in a number of ancient accounts, but historians have been unable to conclusively identify these islands, with the Canary Islands, the Azores, or even Brazil among locations proposed. To Sertorius, these were the fabled Elysium fields, and he was seized with a desire to find them. After living years of unending war, the atrocities of Marius and Sulla, and the recent string of disasters, one could hardly blame Sertorius if he now disappeared into the western horizon and out of the pages of history. However, fate had different plans. His pirate allies, hungry for plunder not peace, abandoned him. With his options severely limited and wishing to keep his men together, Sertorius gave up his dreams of peace. He decided to return to Mauritania and help its people in a rebellion against their king, called Ascali, who was a client of Sulla. This time he and the 1,000 men remaining to him landed successfully. They met Ascali in battle, defeated him, and besieged him in the capital city of Tingis. Sulla sent an army to help Ascali, and Sertorius engaged them in a brief battle. He killed the commander of the Sullan army, which then switched sides, not an uncommon event in those days of turmoil and civil war. With his reinforced army, Sertorius captured Tingis and took control of the province. Again he showed mercy and treated the people with kindness, quickly becoming popular. While consolidating his rule, ambassadors from Lusitania arrived, requesting that Sertorius become their general and lead them in their struggle with Rome. Lusitania, consisting of Portugal and western Spain, was being exploited and oppressed by the governor loyal to Sulla. It would seem that they belatedly came to appreciate the fairness of the governorship of Sertorius. He accepted his proposition, though his motivation is unclear. Why give up a stable position in Mauritania for yet another war? We shall never know. But it is very possible that he still considered himself the legally appointed governor of Hispania and duty-bound to return. In 80 BC, Sertorius sailed to Hispania with a small army of 2,600 Roman and auxiliary troops, accompanied by 700 African mercenaries. They were then joined by 4,000 Lusitanian light troops and 700 cavalry. Hispania was a patchwork of more than 40 tribes spread over the geographically complex peninsula and had nominally been under Roman control since the time of Hannibal, over 100 years before our story. The Roman governors were invariably corrupt and exploitative. There was no Pax Romana, just a string of broken peace treaties, Roman treachery, and massacres. Warfare was endemic, and the tribes had built up a firm hatred of Rome and gained military experience, particularly in guerrilla warfare. The Lusitanians were no exception and had been resistant to the incomplete pacification that had occurred elsewhere. Nonetheless, there were hints of prosperity in the form of silver from the Iberian mines and the production of a fish sauce that was popular in Rome. Consequently, Hispania was garrisoned by 4 Roman generals with 100,000 men. The first battle was against a force of at least 2 legions led by Fulfidius, a former centurion of Sulla. The battle took place by the river Baetis. Sertorius's forces managed to trap Fulfidius against the steep banks of the river, crushing the Romans and killing 2,000 men. The persecutions taking place in Rome had resulted in a steady stream of refugees fleeing to Sertorius for safety. Many of these had military experience and provided officers for native troops. Sertorius dispatched one of these, Lucius Hirtilius, northward. There he defeated the Roman general Lucius Domitus. After a year of fluctuating fortunes, 80 BC ended with Sertorius controlling a large swathe of Hispania. The loss of so much territory greatly perturbed Rome. The Senate upgraded Hispania to a consular province, which meant that Sulla could assign the consul for 80 BC, Metellus Pius, the task of regaining control. Metellus had an excellent record of victories in Africa and in the Social War. He had been one of the first to join Sulla and had been richly rewarded. He now started assembling an army to retake Hispania. We will continue this fascinating look at Quintus Sertorius's life in a couple of weeks' time when we bring you part 2. Thanks again for listening. Once again, if you haven't become a patron yet, then do pop along to patreon.com/The History Network and see what we're doing there. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Liam O'Fuelan, read by Nick Barker.